Hello everyone, and welcome to the Spark Streaming section of the course. Spark Streaming is an extension of the core Spark API that enables scalable, high-throughput, fault-tolerant stream processing of live data streams. Previously, we've been working with data that's already been collected. In this case, we're going to move on to actually accepting live data. Data can be ingested from many sources like Kafka, Flume, Kinesis, or TCP sockets, and it can be processed using complex algorithms expressed with high-level functions like map, reduce, join, and window. So what does this actually look like? Well, basically, you have here in green on the left-hand side whatever your data source is, and that's streaming live data. So Kafka, Flume, Kinesis, HDFS, those are more of open source libraries for actually setting up an infrastructure for streaming. Something you may be more familiar with as just a consumer is something like Twitter, where you have streaming information from different users sending out different tweets. And we're actually going to explore that in this section of the course. So whatever your data source is, Spark Streaming can then ingest it, work with it, and output it either as HDFS into a database or into dashboards showing you live feeds. And later on in the course, we'll actually show you how we can kind of make a pseudo dashboard showing some live stats on Twitter. And internally, Spark Streaming receives live input data streams, and it divides the data into batches, which are then processed by the Spark engine to generate the final stream of results in batches. So it basically looks like this. You see input data stream, that's just coming live, and then you have the batches of the input data coming out after it goes through Spark Streaming, and then it goes through the basic Spark engine, which actually processes the batches of those data points. Now for this course, we're going to first work through just a very simple streaming example. And you're going to need to be able to simultaneously use a Jupyter Notebook and a terminal for this particular example. We're going to do it in the next lecture. Essentially what we're going to be doing is a pretty simple example where we treat our terminal as the input of a live stream, and the Jupyter Notebook is going to be to use Spark Streaming to constantly take in the batches of the data. So we'll type something in our terminal and we'll be able to record it live as if it was a direct stream. And as a quick note, that particular lecture, it's really easiest to follow along through a local installation using VirtualBox. So if you've been using something like EC2 or EMR, I would suggest you take a look at the VirtualBox installation lectures and follow along with those. That's probably the easiest way to do it. Now, after working through that simple example, we'll finish off the course with a Twitter analysis project where we're kind of going to be making a bit of a pseudo dashboard, just a little visualization in Spark and Jupyter Notebook, and that visualization is going to update, let's say, every 15 seconds with different counts on Twitter. Now, to follow along with that particular Twitter project, you'll need to install a few visualization libraries and set up a Twitter developer account. And we're actually going to walk you through all those steps when the time comes during those lectures. Now, for the various possible other data sources that we mentioned earlier, things like Kafka, Flume, Kinesis, realistically, we can't really show that in a single computer setting, and it's actually quite tedious to set up that entire task. However, if in your place of work, you actually necessitate the use of one of those particular data sources, realistically, it would be in a work environment. You wouldn't really run these data sources yourself for personal use. Spark actually provides full integration guides that are really quite thorough. So keep in mind, not every source version, for instance, not every version of Kafka, is available with the Python API. So let's jump to the documentation because I want to show you where you can find additional information on Spark Streaming. It actually has its own full documentation page, and even then on the documentation page, for each particular data source, it has its own integration guide. So it's really quite thorough. If this is something you end up needing to use at work, you have the whole guide there and really thorough instructions. So let's jump over to Spark's main documentation page, and then we'll work through the actual Spark Streaming documentation and show you where you can find everything. After that, we'll head on over to the next lecture where we begin actually coding out with Spark Streaming. Alright, here I am at spark.apache.org, and I'm going to walk you through the documentation, and I'm also going to talk about a more modern version of Spark Streaming that is still in alpha at the point of this filming, so we won't be using it, but I do want you to be aware of it. So if you come over to documentation and go to latest release, Spark 2.1, then you can come to programming guides, and what we're going to be using is called Spark Streaming, but there's also structured streaming, and I want to quickly talk about structured streaming before we jump straight into Spark Streaming. So if you come to structured streaming, there's a very large overview page, but keep in mind that it's still in alpha. It's not even in beta yet, so this is quite early. But basically what this is, it's using Spark Sessions, what we've been using throughout the course, for streaming. And what it does It's basically Spark streaming that's running on top of the Spark SQL engine, and then you can use the dataset and dataframe API in either Scala, Java, or Python. And eventually, at some point in the future, this is going to be your main go-to whenever approaching a streaming problem. And if you come over here, they actually already have quick examples, and what we're going to do is work through the Spark streaming examples, not these structured streaming examples, because this is still too early to basically use it responsibly. You shouldn't really be using this in a production setting. What you should be using at this point in time is the regular Spark streaming. But once you've done Spark streaming, you should come over to structured streaming and check out the examples. It'll be really easy to follow along. It's just basically a few different imports and the syntax has changed, but what's actually going on is quite similar or along the same lines. And to basically kind of show you a simple example, if you keep scrolling down here, and as a basic overview of what you can think structured streaming is it's similar to taking that data stream input and then separating it into batches, but every piece of new data in the data stream is a new row appended to an unbounded table. And basically what the unbounded table means is that it's unbounded in terms of limits of how large it was. We've been working with bounded data where we actually already know how large that data file is. In this case, it's an unbounded table, so you can just keep adding new streams to it. And then you have actual triggers that you can do. So a query on that actual input generates a result table, and every trigger interval, say every second, new rows get appended to the input table, which eventually updates the result table. And whenever the result table gets updated, what you want to do is write the changed result rows to the what's known as an external sink. So this is basically what it looks like here. This is for structured streaming, not Spark streaming. Keep that difference in mind. So you have a trigger, that's the query, then the result, and then some sort of output. Okay, so you can keep looking at this page if you're interested in more details of this. This is still in alpha, I want to stress that. It will be the future, but it's still a little too early for us to really use this responsibly in a production environment. So we'll come back up here. I do want you to check this out at some point in your free time, but if you come back to programming guides, we'll focus on Spark streaming because this is the most stable version. It's been used a lot. It already connects with all those external sources, etc. So what we're going to work through is this quick example. We'll do that in the next lecture. And we'll be using a streaming context, and we'll also be importing a Spark context. Now, context and Spark context in general, that was the main way of using Spark before Spark 2.0 switched to that Spark SQL and Spark data frame, so Spark sessions. So this is kind of a bit of a throwback, but it's the most stable version, especially when dealing with streaming data. You want stuff to be stable and used and tested heavily. So this is what we're going to be focusing on. We'll work through this simple example of reading stuff that's going into the terminal using Python, and then later on we'll also work with actually using this with Twitter. So coming back up here, you can see those diagrams that we were explaining before. You can check out the MLlib operations that are available, but what I wanted to tell you about was inputting from different sources. So if you click here where it says input D streams and receivers, it will take you to the general documentation part where it talks about some advanced sources like Kafka, Flume, Kinesis, and these are things you may be using at a place of work. So if you keep scrolling down here beyond basic sources, it'll come to advanced sources, and then it also has some notes about the Python API. So as of Spark 2.1.1, which is the latest version, Kafka, Kinesis, and Flumes are now available in the Python API. They used to not be, but if you continue going here, this is where I really want to point out some details. Under Kafka, Flume, and Kinesis, there are certain compatibility issues, and there's full integration guides for more details. So for example, let's say at your place of work, you want to implement some Spark streaming tools with Kafka. So once you're on this guide or integration guide page, you'll notice that there's actually some details regarding certain versions of the consumer API for Kafka, especially between versions 0.8, 0.9, and 0.10. So there's actually two separate corresponding Spark streaming packages. And so for these advanced sources that you may find yourself using, there's corresponding Spark streaming packages. Not all of them are available for Python. So for Python, you're going to have to use this Spark streaming Kafka 0.8. Now it does work and it is compatible with 0.9 and 0.10 brokers, but there's certain capabilities that it doesn't have. So it can't do things like SSL support or offset commit APIs. Now the higher versions of Kafka streaming 0.10, this is still an experimental API and it's actually not available for Python yet. That's probably something that's going to come with Spark 2.2. So I just want you to be aware when dealing with some of these advanced sources, not everything is going to be available for you in Python. However, maybe you just wait a year. Heck, the way Spark moves at such speed, you maybe even wait 4 months and stuff will be available more and more. Keep in mind, things are always experimental and buggy when they first come out, so if you want true stability, always go with something that's labeled stable. Okay, so definitely check out the rest of that programming guide. It's really quite thorough and it has a ton of information on it. But for now, let's hop over. I'm going to open up my VirtualBox in the next lecture and set up a simple example of using Spark Streaming to read streaming data from our own terminal. Thanks, and I'll see you at the next lecture.